Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, incorporating the Melbourne School of Design. For anyone I don't know, my name's Professor Alan Perton, I'm Deputy Dean of the Faculty. And firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land in which we work, live and learn, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people who had and still have laws that predate colonisation, and we join in their responsibility to care for country. We also acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledges in and across the Academy. Now tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce the second Dean's Lecture for 2024, titled Collective Repair, and it's a delight to welcome Professor Anna Miljački, who in some respects, it's a welcome back for Anna, but this time in person, as Anna was part of our MSD at Home series during COVID-19, as well as being a panel member discussing creative practice research at the ABP Symposium back in 2022. In addition, Anna was co-editor of Pedagogies for a Broken World, which was a special issue of the Journal of Architectural Education, along with Professor Helene Frichot. So, not a stranger to the faculty, but great to have you here in person, Anna, so welcome. Now, Anna is an acclaimed critic, curator, and Professor of Architecture at MIT, where she teaches history, theory, and design. And has previously taught studios and seminars at Columbia University, City College in New York, and Harvard University, Graduate School of Design, where she also holds a PhD in history and theory of architecture. Now, Anna's research interests range from the role of architecture and architects in the Cold War era of Eastern Europe, through the theories of postmodernism and late socialism, to politics of the contemporary architectural production. Anna was also part of a three-member curatorial team with Eva Fran Gilibert and Ashley Schaefer for the US Pavilion back in 2014 at the Venice Biennale, with a project titled Office US, critically examined the last century of US architectural offices. Now tonight, Anna will present the curatorial and pedagogical work of MIT's Critical Broadcasting Lab, which was established back in 2018. The lab critiques contemporary architecture, it exposes its deep histories, and it cultivates political thinking around architectural practice. Anna's lecture will also focus on the lab's projects that explore and instigate collective work. Importantly, Anna will also dive into the concept of co-authorship as an important political tendency of contemporary work, an experiment through which a different, more tender discipline of architecture might emerge. And we'll also hear about the Collective Architecture Studio as a special pedagogical experiment dedicated to exploring historical and contemporary alternatives to the capitalist production of architecture. Anna will also present the lab's recent audio and video installation titled The Pilgrimage, about memories of childhood visits to Yugoslavian anti-fascist memorials. Lastly, and importantly, we will have a Q&A tonight. We're going to break from tradition while the Dean's not here. So our Director of Undergraduate Studies, Professor Helene Frichot, will be organising a short Q&A, so please get your questions ready. But importantly, please join me in welcoming Professor Anna Miljački.
Thank you, Alan, for that introduction and a little preview. This was your opening remarks slide. So thank you all for coming. Hello, friends and colleagues. I would like to start by thanking Helene Frichot and Dean Willis for this amazing invitation and honor, as well as the two Jasmines who helped me, and Imogen for taking care of me over the last couple of days, which were bumpy. It's my first time in this corner of the world, and I'm super grateful and excited to be here. As you've mentioned, I have on occasion piped in via Zoom, thanks to Hélène, and always sort of yearning to be here in person. So this is, of course, a million times better than Zooming. Although some of you might, watch it on Zoom or something. In many ways, my editorial work, my pedagogical work, and the lab's work are dedicated to the project and the ethos of repair, as well as to collectives. In fact, I see these two terms as contingent on one another. And I've been considering ways in which I have, over the last 30 years, felt disoriented in the kind of neoliberal first world. And think that in a way, my early life in Yugoslavian socialism, um, and also contending with its ruins ever since, uh, in a way makes, together with the work on Second World architects, makes this project of collectives and repair an inevitable political project for me. And some of the dimensions of it will emerge through various works that I show you today. I want to start by telling you a bit about this live project. It's a collaboration with the Architectural League of New York, or between the Critical Broadcasting Lab and the League. And titled "I Would Prefer Not to." It's a podcast, but every piece of architecture, of course, has a complex story to tell about agents, constituents, strategic and fortuitous alignments that made it possible, as well as hopes, fears, and sometimes stories that architects have to tell themselves and others to do their work. So I would prefer not to interviews with architects around the kind of topic on the projects they declined to take on aims to shed light on some of that complexity of actually producing architecture. The idea is to really step into the space that is a space of decision making that doesn't leave traces. So when a decision to not take on a commission is made, it doesn't give us anything to sort of follow up with or to work as historians with. So it's very hard to talk about that dimension of ethical deliberation that architects engage that leaves no built or any other kind of trace. So this is where we come in. I think of the this project as a kind of an infinite oral project. The League might think of it as a series of seasons. But the key thing that we explore in this are questions like, at what point is a commission not worth it? What kind of line gets drawn with a decision to forfeit the possibility of work? When in one's career is it possible or necessary to make such a decision? And so the first two seasons you can find on the League's website and elsewhere on podcast platforms. We're currently in the third season, waiting for Jeannie Gang to approve the episode so we can launch it. Alan mentioned a couple of projects, so I will introduce Log 54 as well as the JE issue that was mentioned. I want to introduce this one, or both of these really are, I think, have issues and follow topics that will resonate with some of the work of the lab that you will see. They represent the combination of a set of concerns that track through different media in my work. Sometimes a question gets asked in an exhibition and ends up being is followed up by a scholarly article. Sometimes things go in other directions. So this recent issue of Log that I co-edited with my sister in arms, Anne Louis, is dedicated to the twin topics of authoring and co-authoring. And I won't rehearse the whole issue for you, but I want to briefly relay our hopes for it. So believing that there is a generation of new work out there now, or at least hoping to simulate it into existence, that self-consciously sidesteps codified cultural narratives of authorship, we offered a sketch of a theory of co-authorship, a polemic, or a kind of carrier bag theory, the way that sci-fi writer Ursula Le Guin liked to think of it. She works with the carrier bag theory of evolution, in which, according to her and the kind of anthropologist, feminist anthropologist she relies on, in which humans' first tools are suggested to have been bags that helped carry seeds and children, instead of the colloquially accepted idea of weapons. And she embraces this idea in order to advocate for what Ursula calls, life stories instead of hero stories. We were hoping to similarly, perhaps, expand authorship to include many forms of agency, or we wanted to think with various authors that we invited about the discipline that might emerge if we replaced the idea and the attitude of authorship with one of co-authorship. And in this, we were helped by various proponents of situated knowledge who only ever see tabula as plena. They helped us think about the ways that co-authorship moves, how it links like and unlike things, and imagine what kinds of epistemologies it may require. We also believed that this situated thinking is capacious enough to include non-human entities, temporalities, and intelligences. We included in the issue this little pattern for a carrier bag by a student at Rice so that everyone can make their own bag. But the key image to have for a carrier bag is, of course, like any tote bag or sling bag that you might have, can carry lots of stuff. So we imagined our issue of log itself as the contents of a kind of carrier bag for a carrier bag theory of co-authorship, in which we included frameworks that continue to operate on what is possible. And authorship is many ways is guided by and organized by legal, cultural, and professional frameworks that continue to keep it in a kind of mode and definition that we all know. But we also added to those frameworks passionate construction, silicone sealant, and the critters who want to traverse it, webbed connections, unfinished objects as both objects and agents in the process of making, rules and regulations, hopes for organizing a disciplinary commons, contestations of regulations, useless products, traces and scars of violent histories, new ways of valuing work, anonymous signatures, developers, financial interests, political allegiances, solidarity, both willed and non-consensual, metaphors, and technologies that enable communication. And then we also included ourselves and all of our readers into our bag because we thought that that hopeful we appropriately designates all of our carrier bag's contents as well as the fiction, tact, and tenderness that enable exchanges of transformative co-authoring. Ursula Le Guin, and you realize that we were relying on her a lot, from whom, of course, we draw the concept itself, described her own carrier sack when writing science fiction as a great heavy sack, full of wimps and klutzes and tiny grains of things smaller than a mustard seed and intricately woven nets, which, when laboriously unknotted, are seen to contain one blue pebble, and imperturbably functioning chronometer telling time on another world, and a mouse's skull full of beginnings without ends, of initiations, of losses, of transformations and translation, and far more tricks than conflicts, far fewer triumphs than snares and delusions, full of spaceships that get stuck, missions that fail, and people who don't understand. This is just to give you the kind of sense of the maybe atmosphere of the co-authorship issue that we were interested in, but also of a kind of disposition of the discipline that we were interested in. The second journal, also hotish off the press, which may have found its way to you if the school is part of the ACSA sponsorship model. I don't know actually how far ACSA goes, is this JE Pedagogies for a Broken World. And in this editorial project, my co-editors Jay Cephas, Igor Marjanovic, and I were similarly thinking about the subjects who get to speak, or more precisely about the subjects who have rarely spoken under our disciplinary spotlight, but may hold the key to transformative thinking and pedagogies that could help us reorient the whole discipline, its politics, its authorities, its intelligences and goals. And this will be continuously the kind of meta project of both the Critical Broadcasting Lab and maybe my own. In both projects, we use the singular term world to signify many worlds, the pluriverse. And in this particular case, in the title, it includes the planetary as it refers to the intersection between many worlds and the pluriverse. So this world of worlds then is an expression of our hope that despite the extraction, erasure, and violence enacted upon and within different worlds, and in different ways, the lessons of survivance in the face of those acts of violence might nevertheless translate across disparate conditions. But as you also see in the title, we were interested in breakdown. And in this, we were following Stephen Jackson and others who think about breakdown and maintenance. If breakdowns have world disclosing properties, which was our starting notion, then survival and survivance underpin particular strategies of perseverance. And in this issue of JV, we wanted to focus on these types of intelligences and away from the white supremacist Eurocentric narrative of progress and its codification of breakdown. Like all editorial projects, we assembled voices that we thought had the capacity to together shift the balance of the discipline. And for some of that, I don't know if you know how JE works, but it is a peer-reviewed journal that has seldom had solicited content. So in this particular issue, we solicited content and interviewed a series of people that we thought were key figures in describing and talking about maintenance and repair in the field, including and in pedagogy as well, including Leslie Loco, Fred Moten, and Stefano Harney, Shannon Mattern, and Wayne Yang. And we did include also work through the peer review process that comes from here that was very important for us. All of the work that was included was contributing to a kind of position that we were interested in supporting by the issue. So when we are set on sidestepping the hero stories or simple reductive causalities or binaries, all formats that have governed our theoretical and historical explanations of the world, how we narrate the world and architecture's involvement or place in it matters a lot. For me, one of the contemporary thinkers of the world of many worlds, or a knotted world, whose style, similarly to Le Guin, corresponds to his epistemology, has been Timothy Morton. Not everything he wrote, but for me, the definition of climate crisis as a kind of hyperobject, as a thing that is massively distributed in time and space relative to humans, hard to comprehend, and even harder to see, viscous, non-local, and involving profoundly different temporalities than those that humans are used to, even as that hyperobject is made up of thousands or millions of small everyday acts by those same humans, among other things, struck me as so apt that I cannot unsee this model of a kind of knottedness across various contemporary phenomena. When he talks about hyperobjects, Morton can substitute sometimes nuclear waste or the planetary for climate crisis. But I would like to offer a few others: the patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, the statisticization of self. And so this extended application of the idea of the hyperobject has fueled really the work and method in different ways. It is the world against which the Critical Broadcasting Lab attempts to do its work. So all of the research and curatorial work that we conduct through the Critical Broadcasting Lab and also in different formats before it is carving a space within the pedagogical space of the school and in the discipline, a space where we can take time to grapple with different types of knottedness. I'm going to use the word again. With architecture deeply entangled, sometimes closer to the center of a knot, sometimes dangling somewhere on its periphery. And so, like most curatorial and exhibition work, this work does not tend towards architectural outcomes, at least not immediately, but towards different ways of narrating questions and gathering comrades around it. When talking about hyperobjects, Morton describes a form of irony that is not the plastic postmodern type, but rather the kind of irony conjured in the presence of hyperobjects. He invokes romantic irony, but now structural to the experience of reality. And I would call it maybe a paradoxically sincere irony, a kind of coupling of self-awareness with the realization that there is no distance to be had. He suggests that sincere irony in the presence of hyperobjects like global warming is a lot like being Jonah in the whale, realizing that he is part of the whale's digestive system, or Han Solo and Leia inside the gigantic worm they think is the surface of an asteroid. So I hope that you see and maybe agree that any individuals, in the old sense of that term, or any individual researcher and producer's action in relation to our contemporary capital scenes, hyperobjects, quite simply requires and relies on this form of romantic irony, in which the narrator realizes that she is part of the story and that there is no meta-language beyond it. The very fact of becoming aware of hyperobjects and acting in their midst produces the effect of irony. And Morton offers that maybe I'll tell you this part. Irony has become the feeling of waking up inside a hyperobject against which we are always in the wrong. Now, if you have arrived here or you're willing to go with me to the belly of the whale, or maybe with Timothy or with Jonah, we can begin sort of contemplating the work of the Critical Broadcasting Lab. For it is here from within the belly of several interlocking hyperobjects, acknowledging that contemporary experience of reality overwhelmingly tends to take on characteristics of irony, and with only a vapor trail of what we once used to think of as the running room or autonomy of culture, as a space from which one could once imagine mounting a critique, that the Critical Broadcasting Lab attempts to highlight issues, broadcast critiques, muck up, and strategically install frictions. Its aims are always better questions, and as it turns out, without that proverbial running room, and within the belly of the whale, working and sometimes playing together seems on some days more effective than all other strategies, and on others, the only strategy. So we're back to collective repair, because in the belly of the whale, it's great to have some playmates and comrades. So though the journals that I presented briefly are relatively recent, the impetus for them has been brewing through our different modes of work, as I said. And I want to show you the pedagogical experiments of the Critical Broadcasting Lab that are, in my mind, part of a larger project of repairing architectural pedagogy. So you see that in the title a little bit, but also you will see it hopefully in these projects. The key one among those pedagogical projects has been the Collective Architecture Studio, which took place in Belgrade first, then in Boston, and back in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And I will probably use both Yugoslavia and Serbia interchangeably. I use Yugoslavia as a place in time, so it's actually relevant to kind of think of it in those terms. In this project, I thought when I first did it in 2019 that it was a one-off project, and I had to just append everything, all the sort of habits that seem to be ingrained in architectural academia in the US. The way, of course, authorship worked and was credited and evaluated, away from the kind of single genius author of designer, as well as the way that places, and we wanted to think about the way in which places with alternative forms of ownership might have dreamt and still dream about architecture. So those were the two key topics. Then I was lucky enough that I got to version the studio. So there were some lessons along that line of testing it, basically. There is maybe now an old saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. This notion is now part of the leftist folklore, and it has been alternatively attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. But it was also important for Mark Fisher, who thought about, or who, thinking about it, framed the notion of capitalist realism. He called capitalist realism the very naturalization of the notion that the politically mutable has become immutable. And this is what we set out to really challenge with the Collective Architecture Studio, the limits of our own capitalist realist imaginations. The first studio, I'm listing every one of us who collectively participated in it. So we started with this picture of 1989 and the way that it has been understood and considered. So we wanted to consider 1989 beyond its common capitalist realist characterization. This is the year, the sort of miraculous year of Eastern European people, understood widely as the triumph of democracy. You might know that philosopher Francis Fukuyama thought of these events, which are also known as the fall of the wall and the fall of communism, as marking the end of history itself. Another philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, thought of historical events of 89 as the time when, or events that had finally placed Eastern Europe on the right path, back on track to becoming proper liberal democracies. And in his view, the events of 89 were a form of compensatory revolution. He was not only the only one, of course. This is the colloquial understanding and widely spread of these events, including among the people of Eastern Europe. But more recently, Croatian philosopher Boris Budin, who is one of the most important commentators on the post-socialist transition everywhere, but also in Yugoslavia, proposed a different reading. He offered that this conception of Eastern Europe or Eastern European revolutions of 1989 as revolutions in reverse infantilized the subjects of post-socialism everywhere, right at the moment when they were in fact coming into their sort of historical and political consciousness. It also decisively and swiftly sent all of the then freed countries straight into transitions towards global capitalism without any assessment of what their socialisms had achieved or what might happen if the link between centralized planning and important and functioning public infrastructure was severed. Imagining 89 to have been in the service of Eastern Europe's catching up to the West also allowed the West not to question its own historical moment and trajectory. So the studio hypothesized that by engaging in retelling the pertinent aspects of historical, architectural, and political heritage, and by offering urban and architectural alternatives from the position that valued socialist heritage in the context of Belgrade, ex-Yugoslavia, the fruits of its labor would have a critical function on both sides of the former Cold War divide. And you're seeing here the 1951 general plan of Belgrade, which hung in the Institute for Planning and Urbanism in Belgrade until it was presented at MoMA, where I took a photo of it. But it hung there, reminding the planners of who they were working for and on whose behalf they were shaping the city. So the two key registers or forms of collectives that we were interested in the studio involved, on one end, architecture for the collective good and collective ownership. And it's important to know that in this context, in socialism, housing was a constitutional right. It was provided through different sort of frameworks to citizens, not for ownership, but for occupation. The land and housing, therefore, were socially owned, which is a little bit different than state-owned, which is then sort of how that transition occurred and is how most people imagine socialism working. But so that's one collective. The other collective that we were interested in was the conception of self-managed group or perhaps common authorship that was implemented and performed through self-managed architectural enterprises, in which there were many female architects. I'm giving you just a little picture of that. In imagining that we could and should take on the archives of Yugoslavian socialism and repurpose them forward, we were joining a real movement against developer housing in the city, responding to this project, an extremely corrupt, large urban development that was erasing everything in its way. And we were doing this at the time that we were in the US living in an unprecedented developer government, or the country. So this is the central train station demolished to make way for Belgrade on the water. Apart from engaging Belgrade so as to challenge the capitalist realist imaginations of our own dreaming, going there was also a way to make my own investment in the collective, both radical and nostalgic, available for the scrutiny of the collective architecture studio. And I was taking cues from one of the most important theorists of transgressive engaged teaching, Bell Hooks, who about 30 years ago called for experimental embodied teaching to challenge habits, teaching that self-consciously cultivates utopia. So the fact that my own biography was deeply implicated in the context to which I was taking students was relevant for the kind of classroom that Bell Hooks advocates for. All of this so that we could eventually collectively ask, what would it mean to upend the cult of individual genius in architecture, to enable the intelligences, protocols, and values of the collective? What would it mean to sidestep the market? How do we even think about that from the context that we occupy? And how do we transform the school itself in order to begin to test answers to these questions? Everything that we were making in the context of the collective architecture studio, or all of the pedagogical sort of experiments that work within the framework of the critical broadcasting lab, involves both producing items that are geared towards intervening in discourse and producing architectural proposals. So there was a kind of self-consciousness amongst us that everything we make has a discursive value as well as a propositional architectural value. We started by trying to understand self-management, which is often presented in books, in photographs like this one of workers coming out of a big self-managed enterprise. Self-management in Yugoslavia was a particular experiment, and I can certainly talk about that more, but one that meant that workers were owners of their means of production. But also what happens when what was a constitutional right to housing in one regime becomes obstacle to market forces in the other. And this is just an image of a sort of a bottom-up museum organized by workers of a big self-managed corporation. I'm calling it corporation, but enterprise, Trudbenik, that involved production of architecture. And after studying self-management and the current state of things in the city, we made devices that challenged and augmented our own collective, which included an archive, protocols of working together, protocols of intervening in that archive and adding to it tools for commenting. And these were sort of full-scale interventions by the group that then we presented first in the gallery called Collective in Belgrade. Some of these included this wearable self-management game, which recast the theoretical tenets of self-management into levels of difficulty of the game. And I'll show you more of it, so I don't need to explain immediately sort of how it works. But it's a wearable game with balls that have to go into particular holes depending on the level of the game. In Belgrade, the Collective Architecture Studio joined activists on behalf of the city and on behalf of that cultural memory of social ownership and the experiment in self-management. They helped us identify sites that were in ownership limbo. They used to have a kind of an archive in which they kept these sites and were trying to prevent them from easily slipping into privatization. And then we were also working with a group called Smarter Building, a group that's thinking about how co-ops are made from bottom up, so that in a way some of the elements of socialist housing could be introduced in the context in a different way now, because since privatization in 1990s, there are no longer any provisions left for housing of any other kind than super high-end developer housing. So it was the activists in Belgrade who identified housing as a key issue to contemplate through architectural terms. And we produced a series of alternative forms of housing that relied in some way on the architectural heritage of the context, but also included new ways of thinking about how we finance it. Some of them worked with existing sites. some of them, and structures. Some of them produced completely new housing. All of them were presented in easily circulatable pattern books so that we could disseminate them with the activists to those who might want to organize co-ops themselves and think about how to finance them. So the last thing that we really wanted to rethink was really the kind of dimension of how our work was evaluated and disseminated in the school itself. And for that, we wanted to completely, and we did completely sort of rethink the review format. I don't know what you do here, but in the final event, we asked our friends, formerly known as critics, to join us in testing our commenting tools. So they started the event.
Talk to each
We also took away the usual sort of organization of that event into students and critics facing each other in a particular sort of powerful and power dynamic. And we introduced a different way of talking about the work so that our friends could share their expertise with us without being involved in judging the work the way that normally the reviews or have tended to go. So this allowed for many smaller private conversations, maybe multiple conversations on same topics with different people. The Balls for All game has had a life since the studio. You will see it in a number of different contexts, but most recently in Berlin for the Great Repair, where it represented a kind of theme of repairing pedagogy. And now you're going to see a few of the rules. I'm just going to let you see the beginning of it. Sounds so proud.
It smells like flood. That's what I had when I was like, oh, this is
More difficult is when most people have visual impairment, etc. The second studio in this collection went to Dudley Street neighborhood in Roxbury. So we had to stay in Boston this particular year, and we went to a neighborhood in the middle of this red line district in Boston, predominantly black neighborhood, where there was a land trust formed in the 1980s that was super successful in managing the land. So what was interesting to me about it was that this is an alternative example of ownership in the midst of a big American city that there is very little knowledge about, which is exactly how capitalist realism works. The alternative exists, but we don't know it and we don't discuss it as an alternative. So in this context, we were working with food project and with local school and their children, and we were interested in figuring out how to talk about both the way in which the history of that land trust developed, how they managed the land, what it would mean to, again, rethink ownership of architecture and land more generally. And we were playing with the kids in the neighborhood to see how this works and to learn from them really about it. The Food Project is an organization that happens to have a farm on one of the pieces of the land trust. and they were interested in developing another sort of building in there, so we were working with them on that. But ultimately, we sent our collective drawing in which we included the history of the red lining to the Tallinn Architecture Biennale. The third collective studio went back to Belgrade, and we started with Block 23, which is a blog that was produced in the 1970s. It has been recently, it's part of the new Belgrade Central Zone, and I can talk about that more if you want. But the new Belgrade Central Zone has been recently placed under protection. So it is now understood as a cultural good, which is curious. Nobody knows exactly what this means. What does protection of architecture means? This is anachronistic architecture produced in socialism now, living in a different or existing in a different regime. The hope among the citizens of these blocks is that protection will fend off developer appetite for all of the green areas that are there that now have legal ways of being privatized. And this is how the block tends to look around there, sort of melancholy stained concrete, which you, I guess MoMA is far, so you might not have been to the MoMA Yugo show, but basically this is part of what the show was kind of relying on, a kind of concrete affect, really, of that old architecture. So in this particular case, we were interested in starting with the question of maintenance, which allowed us both to understand the logics of this architecture and the famous Belgrade apartment school, but also to think about how do we think about maintenance in an existing complex like this? Is there a way to organize the citizens around architectural topics and maintenance of those in some way that would sort of recalibrate that collective or revive it as well? And there was a way of thinking about everyone participating in identifying and discussing different elements. We were interested in celebrating some of the items that constitute those neighborhoods and to transmit them in a way that would, again, bring the citizens of these complexes together. We presented this work in Belgrade again in the gallery collective, now in a different place. But in this case, we had a very large audience of both experts, architects, and citizens or inhabitants of Block 23 who were impressed and sort of found their own Block 23 for the first time discussed in a way that was of interest to them. And they opened the door to their apartments to students, which was super important for us ultimately, because then we could, in fact, verify and see and understand another dimension of that architecture. We presented a series of, again, one-to-one commenting devices. This time they were based on the new art practices in Yugoslavia in the 1970s, which are sort of a particular outcroppings of art in that moment that was critical of the way in which socialism was working in that context. We, of course, again, invited our friends in the final event to participate with us in our or to test our commenting devices. And in this particular studio, this was the first one of the three where I thought the group could make a single project, that I thought that they could collectively withstand that and would be able to carry it. They also thought that. It was pretty difficult, but fruitful. So everything that they made in the context of working on the project had to function both as an attempt or as an item that would enable them to communicate and make decisions, as well as design sort of steps towards something, an architectural proposal. They produced an architectural or a housing proposal that in many ways, again, relied on the logics and knowledge that was deeply embedded in that context. They included in that an idea about revamping the factory, of prefab factory that's nearby, near the site that's closed and dead, but with everything there. And for the final event, they produced a kit for everyone that came, including a kind of persona that they were asking our friends to occupy, or all of us to occupy. Each of the characters was based on people they met or learned about through the process of thinking about this project. And they invited us all to begin negotiating or understanding how we could collectively produce that co-op. So the co-op took on really an important role in this because we understood from, again, the activists in Belgrade that this is a really important sort of move and a platform that they were interested in creating, a way for people to find each other around common concerns, and then try to rewrite the legal and financial instruments that are not there necessarily at the moment to support co-ops bottom up or financing of co-ops. And then they also talked to us about the way in which they would take over a site that's in limbo in New Belgrade, but not with the logics of top-down planning that New Belgrade used to, or that produced New Belgrade, but to actually begin phasing a project or series of housing proposals on that terrain. Out of, or in parallel to some of this work, we, the Critical Broadcasting Lab, produced a smaller project, sharing trainers for the São Paulo Biennial, in which we started with these two images, the three-legged race on one end and feeding with very long spoons. We wanted to think about how, or ways to engage cooperation and coordination in the project. And for it, we produced a kind of a picnic setting, which, as you see, included the game as one of the items in a kind of 3 suitcases that we sent over. This is a pre-pandemic work, so the setting was meant to induce and invoke sharing or drinking and eating together. We produced a series of these fairly simple but items, seating items that required negotiation. And our friends in São Paulo launched the project at the opening by demonstrating and testing the eating and drinking together. You can see how this is like a totally pre-pandemic image. And by playing the game. And then, as I said, this the Balls for All was included recently in the Great Repair exhibition in Berlin. Out of that seating question, we were interested in, again, during the pandemic, we received just enough money to play with it a little bit more. And we were interested in producing some way that these negotiated seating items would make us physically feel each other's presence, even as we are distancing in the context of the pandemic. This eventually became Seesaw set of objects, which we launched at MIT. There were some behaviors we didn't fully anticipate, like this one, but we should have, but you know, it's okay. And we played on them collectively. The next thing, how am I doing with time? I don't know, how are you doing? Are you with me? Okay. Oh gosh, wait, no. Oh no, I need to get to the last project. So Playroom is an exhibition of items that were produced in a series of different pedagogical contexts, all of them games. And I'm going to super fly through them. So some of these games are made in the context of the first history theory class that I teach. They're imagined as interventions in architectural discourse. In the exhibition, we included 5 of them, and we developed the exhibition to travel. It opened a month before we closed for the pandemic, and it closed just before the pandemic. But basically, it's a series of playing tables that each carry a different game. But on the certain nights, they could all carry the same game so that we could, in the school, discuss the same set of issues or issues that are contained in each of the games. Hylanopoly was discussing gentrification around the High Line. with all actual sort of data that comes with or that surrounds this project. Monopoly is, of course, you can recognize that that is the framework in which we were working. So some of the logics of Monopoly continue, but we included air rights, architect facades, critics discussing things. And then as you played, you also were exposed to the cost of architecture. Some of the sort of architect cards or the chance cards were in fact, pieces of news that affected production or material costs in this context. We had Starchitect's money. Portfolio agency was based on Chutes and Ladders, but it spoke about the various agencies that prepare people for schools in the US at least. They're mostly Asian academies of various kinds. There are different levels of entry and operation in those. Our own students were interested in this. We don't understand it when we are looking at these portfolios and files as in admissions. So it was really interesting to have this game be played and discussed in the school. Discarded included or worked as a memory card game. It included different pieces of information for 3 nuggets of information for each of the pieces of architecture that it was discussing. Discarded was the third piece that would include information about human and other costs involved in the building. The contention was that basically we erase, as we know, problematic dimensions of projects in order to continue to sort of think about architecture in a particular way. And the balls for all was included, as well as identity. And the speakers are so it can be different collective IDs. But the key here was the idea about sort of both fostering and enacting collectives through these games that also solicit criticality. So this is the project. I need to say something. So this is the most recent work by the Critical Broadcasting Lab, and it contends with the inevitable and by now maybe unstoppable symbiotic relationship between the digital archives and AI technologies. It looks at, and in its first version, we presented 6 different monuments across Yugoslavia, monuments that are dedicated to anti-fascist struggle and victims of that struggle, and find themselves across the territory of that landscape. In the larger
Less
umbrella
is
project,
more.
we have been experimenting
Less
with printing,
is a bore.
historical.
Less is a bore. And how could architecture do this to us? Less is a bore.
All right,
This
so I mean,
isn't
you are
really
recognizing that these are deep fakes.
who I am.
The idea was to through deep fakes and other ways of messing with the archive, which is of course going to be, so we are relying on, or we're thinking that AI is going to help us predict the future out of an archive that is full of all kinds of problems, including the fact that it's a majorly sort of Eurocentric, progressivist, genius male, all of that. That's already in the archive. If we let the AI scrape this archive, it can only reproduce what's in the archive. So what we're interested with the bootleg project is the bootleg futures project is to actually mess with the archive so that AI has to contend with decoys, mirrors, and other things we might put into it, including histories that are not currently in the archive. But then in the summer of 2022, a story lit up the ex-Yugo sort of landscape of social media, and it affected me in that particular moment. So this is a deeply personal project in some way. This particular memorial, the Partisan Memorial Cemetery, was vandalized with all of the gravestones being destroyed. it happens to be a monument produced by a monument artist and architect, Bogdan Bogdanovic. It's an amazing sort of land art project, and in a divided city still. And so for me, it was important to think about the ways in which socialism, self-management, tolerance, inclusion intersect in some of this work in architecture of Yugoslavia generally, but specifically in these post-war sort of monuments that were meant to wire a generation or several generations for anti-fascism and inclusive living. And even though they have been already swallowed by a kind of entropic appetites of aging collective memory, which has been exacerbated by various political interests in forgetting their meaning. So for those of us who claim citizenship in this sort of conceptual country, Yugoslavia, 30 years after its destruction, memorials like these serve as markers. They help us orient ourselves backward and forward. And I thought that, and maybe they're anachronistic, but I thought that even that memory is anachronistic, that we might have of our visits to them, which is collective visits, going on a bus with, sandwiches that your parents presented or prepared for you, and then hearing collectively about the histories that they are somehow standing for. So I thought that even that kind of anachronistic memory is relevant, and we need to figure out how to work with it or maybe produce it synthetically. So in this case, we worked with 6 monuments, and we trained a style GAN 3 on archival and individual photo documentation of these memorials. So the project is based on or has learned from archival images, as I said, as well as social media, skipping the selfies in front of killing fields for various reasons, but basically the kind of generative adversarial network, which is a deep machine learning model widely available since 2021, was trained on them, and we worked a lot with how it would synthesize videos from it. This is a video we're currently working on, by a monument by Kana Radevic in Montenegro. And we presented it then as a kind of synthetic memory for those who might visit and to experience it collectively. So for those who have the memory, this would feel like it. For those who don't, I was hoping that there would be enough affect and a kind of haunting invitation to understand what these monuments are. You might know some of these monuments. There's at least one of them that has been in an Australian ad for sunglasses, which they tried to take down at some point, or at least historians in Yugoslavia tried to take it on end here.
And I'm getting the kind of message to, yeah. So can we all put our hands together so much and thank Anna.
Thank you.